raging inferno stretching 3,000 miles.
If you imagine 10,000 Hiroshimas going off, that's probably what this would have been like if you had had something that devastating.
An entire continent swallowed by a cloud of dust.
It's an apocalypse, basically. It's, everything that you've known your whole life, has been torn apart.
Could a comet have unleashed an ancient megastorm that swept across North America and killed off nearly all life on the continent?
It would have been sort of end of a world sort of scenario for those people.
And could it happen again? Years ago, a comet nearly 3 miles wide plunges through the atmosphere. It detonates above North America with a force equal to 20 million megatons, larger than a simultaneous blast by all the nuclear weapons in history. The explosion sends a trail of fiery fragments toward the continent below. Across North America, wildfires begin raging, scorching everything in their paths. Eventually, these fires stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific.
A wildfire on the scale of an entire continent is almost impossible for us to visualize. And, of course, it goes without saying that the amount of damage would be fantastic.
Fires fill the air with soot, ash, and smoke, while super-hot cometary debris continues to rain down on the continent.
We're talking about something that was significant enough to impact our atmosphere and come very close to the surface, and probably created a shock wave and superheated the whole North American continent.
The atmosphere becomes so polluted that people and animals suffocate where they stand. The few humans and animals who survived the fires and dust storms slowly succumb to starvation.
There wouldn't have been any food for them to eat, and they would have slowly starved to death and died off. I mean, it's an apocalypse, basically. It's, everything that you've known your whole life has been torn apart.
For any people who are here, it's hard to imagine a more earth-shattering event than that.
If a comet did cause these fires and dust storms, it would be responsible for one of the largest extinction events in the history of the world. All across North America, the fossil record reveals a catastrophic event did in fact take place 13,000 years ago. In a geological instant, large mammals like mammoths and mastodons, along with the continent's Stone Age human civilization known as the Clovis, became extinct.
That was a very unique culture, the Clovis culture, and it simply doesn't seem to move beyond 13,000 years in the rock record. It just ceases to exist.
The woolly mammoths, the mastodons, the saber-tooth tigers, the types of beasts that you dream about as kids. These are the ones who were roaming our plains, and these are the ones that were raising havoc. These were the animals we were hunting.
The loss of the Ice Age megafauna, especially mammoths and mastodons. It's a well-known fact that they went away pretty quickly. And of course, the Clovis culture seems to disappear as well. They were the last people probably in what we think of as North America to see the great Ice Age beasts.
This sudden disappearance of both animals and humans does not show up anywhere else on the planet. But what could have caused nearly all life in North America to vanish so quickly? For decades, scientists have speculated about what could have happened. One popular theory suggested that the Clovis culture hunted the animals into extinction and destroyed the food chain. Other scientists argued that a massive plague may have killed off both humans and animals. Or possibly a severe climate change plunged the Earth into an ice age.
Natural forces can be tremendously destructive and probably have caused most of the mass extinctions in the past. We're tremendously influenced by events outside of the Earth, and that always we should keep in mind. We're under the influence of planetary forces, and some of those kind of appear out of the blue, kind of big accidents.
No hard evidence has ever been produced to conclusively prove what actually happened in North America 13,000 years ago. Then, in 2007, a new theory was proposed. It suggested the trigger for this continent-wide catastrophe didn't come from Earth at all, but from space, in the form of a comet. A team of scientists from institutions all across the United States argued that a comet exploding upon entering the Earth's atmosphere was the most probable explanation. They believed the blast and debris from the comet could have set off massive fires and dust storms. This would explain the sudden disappearance of virtually all life on the continent. They called the potential extraterrestrial body the Clovis Comet, for the culture it devastated. The idea of a comet made sense. After all, comets and asteroids have been a constant threat since the dawn of time.
Comets smacked into the Earth, they almost certainly have. Comets probably delivered much of the carbon-based materials and at least some of the water that allowed life to form some 3.9 billion years ago. So we owe our very existence to them. They would punctuate evolution, allowing only the most adaptable species to evolve further.
Hundreds of comets and asteroids hurtle into the Earth's atmosphere every year. Most burn up or explode before they reach the surface.
You have to realize, when you think about these threats, we have an explosion in the atmosphere caused by an impact that's about double the size of the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima every year. So when you realize that, and the fact that we're sitting happy, having dinner, going to parties, going to school, you know, that's a part of our daily life. Yet this is happening somewhere on the Earth every year.
Throughout history, some of these comets and asteroids have changed the Earth in violent ways.
65 million years ago, a comet or an asteroid took out the dinosaurs, allowing the more adaptable mammals to evolve further and more easily. So we owe our very existence and our position atop the food chain to a comet or an asteroid that took out our principal competition some 65 million years ago.
Not only did you have a giant impact event, but you also had a big shock heating of the atmosphere, and there was a significant fire.
As recently as 100 years ago, a comet was responsible for massive destruction. In 1908, a comet entering the atmosphere exploded in midair 5 miles above the Tunguska River in Siberia. The blast released energy greater than a 10-megaton nuclear explosion, about 1,000 times that of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima.
It literally exploded about 5 miles above the surface of the Earth, blasted out, literally leveled the trees, except right below the point of explosion. There are people who were thrown off their feet, reindeer that were burned, trees literally had the fur just simply ripped right off of it, and they laid down as if somebody had played with their Tinker Toys. It was an amazing event. And there are people who were killed, largely by aftermaths of this. This is the model that we have that would keep us up at night of something coming from space.
The stunning devastation wreaked by the comet's explosion can be seen here in these pictures of the Siberian forests. More than 80 million trees scorched and flattened over hundreds of square miles.
When Tunguska came in, it ran into our atmosphere. Our atmosphere acted as a brick wall. So instead of colliding with the Earth and exploding at that point, it actually collided with the compressed atmosphere. Kind of like imagining above-ground nuclear explosion without all that radioactivity. We're now dealing with the equivalent of a fire hose coming down on Earth at the same time we're having a shock wave traveling across the surface.
In 1908, Tunguska was inhabited by only a few hundred people. But had the comet entered Earth's atmosphere a few hours earlier, it would have exploded over Western Europe, potentially killing millions of people. At the time, the population of London was 7 million.
If the comet of Tunguska had actually exploded over London, that would have caused widespread devastation. We were just incredibly fortunate that this thing exploded over Siberia. It was a total fluke.
The vast destruction in Siberia provides clear evidence that an exploding comet can have a lethal impact on the Earth. But the Tunguska comet was only about 165 feet wide. The Clovis comet that exploded over North America 13,000 years ago would have been nearly 3 miles wide, almost 100 times bigger.
The type of event that occurred for Tunguska had to have been small compared to the one that caused all this massive disappearance of peoples and mammals. It had to be much more devastating. It had to be much more widespread. It had to cover a large part of North America.
Could the explosion of a massive comet in Earth's atmosphere destroy an entire continent?
If you really did have this huge cometary explosion, you'd potentially had large areas that would have been decimated by forest fires. It would have been a very, very strange place with charcoal and dust everywhere on the surface where these fires have gone through.
Could a comet really be responsible for the destruction of nearly all life in North America 13,000 years ago? The search was on for evidence that could definitively link a comet to this continent-wide disaster. Scientists began their search by looking back at an astounding discovery made in 1966. Buried in the geological record from 13,000 years ago is something strange. A 2-inch thick layer of black fossilized rock. The same bizarre layer is found at Clovis sites, stretching from the Carolinas to California. Scientists dubbed this layer the Black Mat. They believe the Black Mat holds the secret to what nearly wiped out North America 13,000 years ago. Years ago, nearly all life in North America was destroyed in one massive event. Large animals like mammoths and saber-toothed tigers were killed off. Even the earliest Americans, known as the Clovis culture, were wiped out. Their fossils, tools, and all signs of life stop appearing at one moment in the geological record. The decline of the Clovis culture marked the end of human occupation of North America. It would be perhaps a century before humans set foot on this continent again.
What archaeologists call the Clovis people would have been those humans that were pretty widespread in what we now know as the United States around 13,000 calendar years ago. The Clovis people were us. They were probably Asians. They would have somehow been the ancestors of what we know as the American Indian, perhaps the distant ancestors of them. They were certainly people who in every way had the same intellectual capacity we do. So we have to think of them really as us, but in their world, which is very different than our world.
But what would be powerful enough to kill an entire continent?
It's difficult to imagine how you can kill a continent. It really is. And this is the difficult part about the hypothesis.
Theories about what happened 13,000 years ago abound. Scientists have suggested massive climate change, a continent-wide plague, or even a disruption in the food chain as possible scenarios. But none of these has been proven.
It's been a puzzle for some time. I think that the idea that climate would have been the culprit has been sort of perhaps intuitively obvious to many geologists and paleontologists who've observed the changes in life over many millions of years.
Scientists had puzzled about this for a long time. You know, there was suggestion that there was a pandemic disease that wiped these animals out. No evidence for it.
One thing is very clear. Something massive happened. And this event represents one of the biggest extinctions in the history of the world. In 2007, a new theory was proposed, that a comet exploded in the atmosphere and triggered a series of events that destroyed animals and humans.
It would have been sort of end of the world sort of scenario for those people.
If a comet did explode in the planet's atmosphere 13,000 years ago, the evidence has to exist. The first place scientists looked was in the geological record. In more than 20 different Clovis archaeological sites across North America, scientists have found something unusual, a 2-inch layer which they have dubbed a black mat. The unusual sediment dates to approximately 13,000 years ago, suggesting this layer could be tied to the extinction event. Beneath the black mat, mammoth bones and artifacts of the prehistoric Clovis people are found. Just above the black mat layer, few signs of humans or animals.
The telltale signs we do have at that boundary, at that time, these hints that something went on. And these hints include fine debris that was spread over the area. There was a layer where there were, largely where all the mammals disappeared, and then there was this massive burning.
Could there also be physical evidence of a comet in the black mat? Scientists believe that if a comet were responsible for devastating North America, it would leave behind an interstellar trail, similar to the famous KT layer, a layer of clay that proved a massive asteroid slammed into the Earth 65 million years ago, killing the dinosaurs.
The KT boundary, the Cretaceous-Tertiary boundary, this was a layer that was found at a certain horizon where there was a sudden dying across here, 75% of the species. They discovered this big giant spike of iridium, and not just iridium, it was other types of elements that are associated with iridium that tells you that this had to be from a cosmic abundance, that is something that came from space.
In 2005, scientists gathered at a Clovis site known as Topper in South Carolina, looking for evidence of a comet. Professor Albert Goodyear was lead archaeologist at the site.
This is the approximate location sampled here in 2005. A large number of examples of the magnetized particles that they think came from literally out of space, and they were very clearly associated with the Clovis layer. Later on in the laboratory, they found high concentrations of iridium, nickel, and some sort of carbonized glass. Topper has trillions and trillions of nanodiamonds. The geophysicists regard nanodiamonds as sort of a high probability extraterrestrial element.
Just like with the KT layer, scientists now had proof that a comet or asteroid had played a role in the extinction of life in North America. But unlike 65 million years ago, when an asteroid left an enormous impact crater in the Yucatan Peninsula, there was no crater tied to an event in North America 13,000 years ago. Scientists believe the Clovis comet must have exploded in midair, just like the Tunguska comet of 1908.
When you have an impact, you're transferring all that energy of motion, and you're converting it into energy of heat. It's still coming in as it flies through the atmosphere. So we're now dealing with the equivalent of a fire hose coming down on Earth at the same time we're having a shock wave traveling across the surface.
While it's unlikely a cometary explosion alone could have destroyed the continent, perhaps the aftermath of the explosion could. Was there also evidence of what happened after the explosion in the black mat layer? Professor Luann Becker of Johns Hopkins University studied samples taken from sites across the continent, searching for clues that a massive catastrophic event had taken place after the explosion. Samples taken from Clovis sites from California to the Carolinas all revealed evidence of soot. The presence of soot in each of these locations suggests that massive fires must have taken place right after the explosion and possibly swept across the continent.
I think there was significant fires at this event. Everywhere we looked, there's evidence for charcoal and fire in the form of what we call soot. This type of material only happens when you have huge firestorms.
Fiery fragments could certainly have set portions of the continent on fire, but could those fires have spread 3,000 miles and engulfed the entire continent?
If there were ever some sort of circumstance that led to giant wildfires spreading across all of North America, it's almost inconceivable how terrifying that would be for any population that was there.
Could wildfires really have scorched an entire continent, wiping out a civilization and driving many species into extinction? "13,000 years ago, a comet 3 miles wide explodes over North America. The massive shockwave sends fiery fragments raining down on the continent below. Could wildfires have set the continent ablaze and led to the extinction of almost all animal and human life?
You know, a wildfire on the scale of an entire continent is almost impossible for us to visualize. And of course, it goes without saying that the amount of damage would be fantastic.
Wildfires are one of the deadliest forces in nature. Leaping rivers, ravaging grasslands and forests, they consume everything in their paths when propelled forward by high-speed winds. But would they be capable of sweeping 3,000 miles across an entire continent?
A hurricane, will be over in a day, day and a half. An earthquake is an instant occurrence, of course, and then you have to deal with the fallout. But fires truly are perhaps the most unpredictable of all the natural disasters out there, and so you don't know what's going to happen to you. It's so clearly unhuman. Nothing is living there. I mean, everything flees in front of a fire. Animals, birds, everything. And that's a sense of the place that no one wants to be.
If North America were set on fire by an explosion of a comet 13,000 years ago, it would have been perhaps the largest firestorm in the history of the world. To get a glimpse into the power of a firestorm, we can look at the recent past. In 2007, one of the most destructive wildfires of the last 100 years rampaged through Southern California.
Anybody who lived through some of those fires understands how incredibly severe and how quickly the fires can spread. And it happens really fast, and there's not a lot you can do about it to get out of the way. If you happen to be in that line of fire, you may not make it.
What makes wildfires so frightening is that they move incredibly fast. They move faster than firefighters can keep up with them. Sometimes in really serious situations, they move faster than people can escape. And it's the wind that's doing that.
With Santa Ana winds exceeding 100 miles per hour and fanning the flames, the California wildfires stretched more than 150 miles from San Diego to Malibu, devastating more than 2,000 homes and triggering the evacuation of nearly 1 million people.
A fire that size, you can't put it out. You need a hose the size of Los Angeles to put this out yourself. It's like a furnace. For people who were living in these areas, they could sense it when it was close, visible to them. They could feel the heat. They could see the smoke, and so it's an overwhelming sound as well. It's something that they say, is like nothing else on Earth.
The California wildfires were devastating, but imagine if they stretched across an entire continent. The firestorms 13,000 years ago would have been nearly 200 times bigger.
I lived in California. If you look down towards LA where all those fires were happening, you know, you saw soot as far as where I lived in Santa Barbara. That's a good distance away, and yet that stuff spreads, and you know, the whole sky is orange, and so it's just kind of a glimmer of what it must have looked like over the entire continent of North America at that time.
Is it possible for wildfires to spread across an entire continent? The Clovis Comet may have created the perfect scenario for this to happen. The remnants of the Clovis Comet would have sent fiery fragments raining down over large parts of North America. This massive amount of debris easily could have generated huge wildfires. And at the time, much of North America was covered in forests and vast grasslands, material that would have been primed to burn.
When you go back, say, about 13,000 years ago in North America, that Paleolithic period, North America looked a lot like what Africa looks like today.
The shockwave also sent out in the wake of the comet's explosion would have sent hurricane-force winds racing across the continent at hundreds of miles an hour, 10 times faster than the powerful Santa Ana winds of the 2007 California wildfires. These winds would have helped fan the flames into a continent-wide inferno.
Once you get a significant amount of fire going and you have the right kind of winds blowing, then that's when it becomes dangerous.
The stronger the winds, and these winds were incredibly strong, all of a sudden it's like a long-distance flamethrower.
The comet would have unleashed the largest firestorm the world has ever seen.
If we really did have that kind of big wildfire in North America, for any people who were here, it's hard to imagine a more earth-shattering event than that. Everything they knew about their way of life would have been completely disrupted.
Those people and animals not caught in the fire or suffering from smoke inhalation would have had nowhere to go and nothing to eat.
Many, many species would probably have been destroyed. If not immediately killed in the fire, they might have had a very, very hard time surviving whatever was left of the land thereafter. There would have been a lot of widespread starvation. It might not have led to the extinction of all of those people, but they were forced to come to grips with a very radical change of life.
You've left behind a pretty destitute situation. For those animals that have survived, they're going to immediately be affected by what's happening with their ecosystem.
When the storms finally died down, the Clovis culture was nearly extinct, and certain species of animals would never be seen again. And in some instances, the animals that did survive would never be the same again. The bison has become an icon of the American plains, but these powerful animals may actually be a smaller version of a much larger ancestor.
The modern bison does not seem to exist in the Ice Age fossil record, and that's been curious because the modern bison seems to appear at a later time. The older ones have much longer horns.
It's possible today's bison could be some sort of genetic mutation of the ancient bison. And for some reason, these smaller bison survived the storm, passing on their genes, while the traits of their larger relatives were lost.
There could have been a genetic bottleneck, which is something that occurs when populations are brought to very low numbers, and in situations like that, quite profound changes can happen because the gene pool, as it were, has been so much reduced.
The storm that swept across North America 13,000 years ago would have been one of the worst extinction events in the history of the planet. But it's possible the aftermath of this ancient disaster may have also created a lethal scenario that plunged the planet into an even greater worldwide crisis. 13,000 years ago, a comet may have been the trigger for one of the most destructive events in history. Exploding high in the atmosphere, burning cometary debris would have rained down on North America, triggering wildfires that stretched across the continent.
It's a splatter effect. The fires with these huge air bursts, destroying perhaps vegetation and landscape, putting perhaps soot in the atmosphere.
But it may not have been fires stretching for thousands of miles that was the most lethal aftermath of this comet. In addition to the fiery fragments sent plummeting to the continent below, the nearly 3-mile-wide comet also unleashed massive amounts of dust and debris into the atmosphere after its explosion. As the dust rained down, it combined with the vast amounts of soot being created by wildfires. Together, the two created a deadly mix that blanketed much of the continent in a toxic haze. The few humans and animals that had avoided the fires would have suffocated, choking to death on dust.
If you load the atmosphere with a lot of dust, it's going to spread out and it's going to potentially cover the range and the area that was affected by the actual blast itself.
Buried in the fossil record at Clovis sites stretching from northern Canada to southern California is evidence of identical dust particles, suggesting that this lethal cloud literally blanketed the continent.
Dust storms have the capacity to kill people and animals by suffocating. If you're breathing in this sand, this dust, and it's getting in your lungs, it's really like drowning. It's drowning in this dry dust.
North America has been ravaged by dust storms before, but could anything match what happened 13,000 years ago? The closest thing may have been what has become known as the Dust Bowl of the Great Depression. In the 1930s, dust storms blanketed the central plains of the United States, stretching from New Mexico and Colorado to Oklahoma and Kansas. The storms were nicknamed black blizzards because they often lasted for days as clouds of black dust would blow across the Great Plains. People who experienced the dust storms were often unable to see more than a few feet in front of them.
If you live in one of these storms, you could be blinded by the dust flying in your face. It creeps under doors, it buries cars, it buries plant life. You can have dust inches high, sort of drifting up on the floors of your house. They can be extremely destructive.
The Dust Bowl stretched across 150,000 square miles, but its impact pales in comparison to the aftermath of the Clovis Comet. The dust storm unleashed by the Clovis Comet could have covered 3.8 million square miles, an area 25 times larger than the Dust Bowl. The dust from the Clovis Comet was composed of soot and cometary debris. It was also thicker and more deadly than the Dust Bowl, which consisted of mostly thin topsoil.
Fire vaporized the trees and all the organic matter in the soil and turned it into, charcoal dust.
Although the destruction unleashed on North America alone would have created one of the most lethal extinction events in the history of our planet, the aftermath of the comet's dust storm may have reached around the globe with devastating implications.
That changes the climate, changes the ecosystem. What we're talking about now is something on a big, broader scale. When you darken good portions of the Earth for weeks at a time, it eventually will have its effect on all parts of the ecosystem.
The amount of soot being thrown into the air might have had global consequences for how much it might have cooled the Earth during some of this time. Even people who would be living far, far away from the site of this comet impact could still be affected by it because of the amount of dust that would be thrown up into the air. that dust would spread around the Earth in many cases, and it would shut out their sun. They would suddenly find temperatures plunging. It would be a terrifying experience.
Globally, the amount of dust and soot mixing in the atmosphere might have blocked out the sun, causing temperatures to drop.
You're going to block sunlight, you're going to cause some cooling, you're going to change the weather patterns and potentially cause thunderstorms, and the whole dynamic is changed by the presence of the dust particles. And so that changes the climate, changes the ecosystem.
But the most far-reaching consequence of this dust storm may have been triggered when the storm died down. Once the dust and soot mixture fell out of the atmosphere, vast quantities of it would have come to rest on a massive ice sheet that covered nearly all of Canada.
When you accrete a lot of dust into the atmosphere, eventually it's going to make its way to the ice sheet. And so you're going to go from what is a white ice sheet to parts of the ice sheet that are going to be covered with dark material. And that's going to change the response of the sunlight. It could cause some significant melting.
As the darkened ice sheet increased absorption of sunlight, it began melting at an accelerated rate. The amount of glacial meltwater flowing into the ocean would have been greater than all the fresh water in the world's modern lakes, creating the potential for climatic disaster.
If you were to release tens of thousands of gallons of fresh water into the Atlantic Ocean, like we think may have happened, this would change the whole circulation of the oceans.
This huge amount of water pouring into the world's oceans would have disrupted the currents and sent temperatures plunging by 5 to 10 degrees across North America and Europe, triggering an ice age. This ice age lasted more than 1,000 years, as glaciers crept across the landscape, devouring forests. Global temperatures dropped to freezing levels. The food chain became disrupted. The human population around the world plunged.
Clearly there was an event. It was a significant event that affected life, especially in North America and Northern Europe. And we see that in the biologic record, we see it in the climate record, we see it in the oceanographic record. I mean, we even see it in the ice cores.
The idea that the Clovis comet killed off nearly all life in North America and triggered a global ice age has been met with some skepticism.
This is not a slam dunk case, and I think everybody acknowledges this. But as a hypothesis that's testable, we've got all the elements of saying there was change. Where we see debris, we know that there's a black mat indicating a great dying. But all these are only indicating the fact that we had change, that is, a climate change. So the issue is what caused the climate change and what those processes are.
It's kind of a to-be-continued story here. There's a number of theories, but the one that we think may be an all-encompassing theory is the possibility of an extraterrestrial event.
As scientists continue to search for the exact answer to what caused the mass extinction 13,000 years ago, the fact remains that from the beginning of time, asteroids and comets have collided with our planet, causing unimaginable devastation. The questions for us are, when will the next one hit? What happens when it does? And can anything be done to stop it? The explosion of the Clovis comet 13,000 years ago may have triggered one of the worst disasters in the history of the world. Massive wildfires and dust storms engulfed North America and drove much of the continent to the edge of extinction. Could this happen again? Could another comet unleash death and destruction?
We can't necessarily tell where the comets are coming from. We just know that they are there. The question is, can we defend ourselves against the next big one? We're not there yet. I think we still have time to figure this out. But I think we have to figure this out. It's not for the ones that are going to cause a bad day. We're talking for the one that's going to cause a bad world.
It's not a question of if another comet will plunge into the Earth's atmosphere. It's a question of when. More than 5,000 comets and asteroids have been discovered by scientists roaming throughout our solar system. Most are small and would simply burn up on entering the Earth's atmosphere. But more than 700 of them are over a mile in diameter, large enough to unleash significant damage if just one impacted the planet or exploded in the atmosphere.
And they almost have their own engine in them. They're almost like living. And if they stay back where they're supposed to, we're safe. It's when they begin to approach and they get on this freeway heading toward the Earth that we have to worry that we're on the on-ramp with them as well.
An object that is a few kilometers in extent would cause an explosive event on the Earth's surface that would dwarf the entire nuclear arsenal of the countries on the Earth today.
What if a comet detonated over North America today? If one similar in size to the Clovis comet exploded over an American city like Boston, the damage would be devastating, dwarfing any possible man-made attack.
If it just exploded as an airburst, it would fry Boston, basically just destroy it. There wouldn't be really much left at all. A bit of rubble would have been sort of end of the world sort of scenario for those people.
The city and surrounding area, which is home to more than 4 million people, would almost instantly be left in smoldering ruins. Fiery debris would ignite wildfires across New England. If the fires could not be contained, they could rapidly spread across the land, threatening New York, Montreal, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., and the entire North American continent. Not only would uncontrollable wildfires be devastating, but the massive amounts of soot and cometary dust that would be swept into the atmosphere and land on polar ice caps could accelerate the process of global warming many believe is already underway. It could be a lethal scenario for people around the world as the oceans reclaim thousands of miles of coastline.
We're just starting to wake up far more to the fact that comets are far more frequent than we've been led to believe.
But what if a large comet were on a trajectory to hit the Earth? Is there any way to prevent it from unleashing massive destruction? Today, NASA is tracking many of the more than 5,000 objects roaming our solar system. NASA's goal is to find any threats in space, well in advance of potential contact with Earth.
If we find an object, either a comet or an asteroid, that is on an Earth-threatening trajectory, we have the technology to deal with it if we find them early enough. All we have to do is slow it down or speed it up just by a millimeter per second or so that in 10 or 20 or 30 years, when it was scheduled to hit the Earth, it wouldn't.
The possibility that NASA could nudge a comet just a millimeter left or right off its trajectory so it misses Earth and avoids another catastrophic event sounds like pure science fiction. Yet in July of 2005, NASA scientists proved they could do just that with Comet Tempel 1.
We actually ran into that comet with a spacecraft.
Team, we got a compliment.
Slowing it down just a bit so that we actually changed its orbit.
Comet Tempel 1 was not on a collision course with Earth, but NASA's success at altering its orbit showed that scientists have the potential to move disaster out of our path.
Astronomers are watching for these objects that are heading for the Earth or could head for the Earth. You know, it's very gratifying to know that we can map these objects and we know what their orbits are, we know where they're going to go in the future. The real problem is that do we have all of them? Have we tagged every one of them? And are there events that could occur in this asteroid belt that could send more stuff our way? And that's what we don't know. And then the question is, can we defend ourselves against the next big one?
Scientists continue to scour the skies looking for the next threat that might strike North America. Only by watching the stars can we tell when the next comet might be on a collision course with Earth.